There is a morning in July 1988 at a penthouse apartment on Sutton Place in New York City that those who know the story cannot read about without stopping. Gloria Vanderbilt is 63 years old. She is standing on the terrace of the 14th floor of her apartment, looking at her son Carter. He is 23. He is a Princeton graduate, an editor at a respected magazine, a young man by every visible measure, at the beginning of something rather than the end of it. She has called her doctor, who is on his way. She is trying to speak calmly, to hold something together with the quality of her presence, the way she has been holding things together since she was 10 years old, and a courtroom full of strangers were deciding who owned her. Carter climbs over the terrace wall. He swings there for a moment, like a gymnast, his mother reaching for him, and then he lets go. The police report. The doctor who arrived too late. The 14 floors, the pavement below. She had lost her father before she could remember him. She had lost the only childhood home she had known in a courtroom when she was 10. She had survived 4 marriages, 3 of them painful. She had been called the poor little rich girl since before she was old enough to understand what poor meant, and had spent 95 years demonstrating, with remarkable consistency, that the description was both accurate and insufficient. And now she was standing on a terrace on Sutton Place, looking at the space where her son had been. She did not break. This is the thing that everyone who knew her in the years that followed has said, with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. She did not break. She painted, she wrote, she designed. She said, to anyone who asked, that something wonderful was always about to happen. She was not performing optimism. She had discovered, in the years of accumulating loss, something that the losses could not reach a quality of self that was not constituted by circumstances and could not therefore be dismantled by them. Her story does not fit the shape of a cautionary tale, although it contains material for several. It fits the shape of something rarer. A life of genuine creation, built against the grain of everything that was given to her and taken from her, by a woman who had every reason to become a symbol and chose, instead, to become a person. The Vanderbilt inheritance. She was born Gloria Laura Vanderbilt on the 20th of February, 1924, in New York City, born into a name that, even then, even in a country a century removed from Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt's first ferry across New York Harbor, carried a specific gravity. The Vanderbilt name was American aristocracy in the truest available sense, a dynasty built from nothing, expanded into something incomprehensible, and then dissipated across 3 generations, with the thoroughness of a dynasty that had confused the accumulation of wealth with the acquisition of wisdom. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, the original, had arrived in New York as a boy from Staten Island and had built, through a combination of ferocious energy and commercial intelligence that his contemporaries found alternately admirable and terrifying, the largest fortune in the United States. He ran steamships first, then railroads, and when he died in 1877 he left $100 million at that moment, more than the entire contents of the United States Treasury, to his eldest son, William Henry, with a few modest provisions for the other children. William Henry doubled it. His sons spent it. By the time Gloria's father Reginald arrived at his majority, the Vanderbilt fortune had passed through 3 generations of the particular talent for expenditure that very large fortunes seem to generate in the people who inherit them without having earned them. Arthur Vanderbilt II, who wrote the family's history in a book called Fortune's Children, observed that the Vanderbilts had spent their money not on great philanthropic or intellectual projects. The Carnegies and Rockefellers of the same era at least left libraries and universities in their wake, but on houses. The houses were extraordinary. Vanderbilt mansions lined Fifth Avenue. Vanderbilt summer cottages in Newport occupied the Cliff Walk. Vanderbilt estates in the Hudson Valley commanded views that their owners experienced from the windows of their private railway carriages. The Breakers in Newport had 70 rooms and was used for 2 months a year. Marble House, also in Newport, cost $11 million to build in 1892, a sum that its owner, William Kissam Vanderbilt, appears to have spent without particularly noticing it. By 1934, Arthur Vanderbilt II observed, not one of the original Vanderbilt mansions was still in the family's hands. Everyone had been sold, demolished, or donated the physical record of a dynasty's passage through money on a scale that required institutional rather than personal accounting to comprehend. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt was 43 years older than his wife and had spent the intervening decades deploying the family's remaining capital on horses, gambling, and the kind of social life that required constant, expensive maintenance. He had inherited $7.5 million at 21. By the time his daughter was born, he had spent through nearly all of it. The creditors were already assembling. The trust fund revenues were already committed elsewhere, and he was, behind the inherited good looks and the club memberships and the Newport estate, a man in irreversible physical decline from the cirrhosis that decades of heavy drinking had produced. He died in September 1925, when Gloria was 17 months old. She did not remember him. She would spend the rest of her life aware of his absence in the specific way that children who lose a parent before memory forms are aware of it as a kind of shape in the space where something should be, an absence that organizes everything around it without being directly visible. She later said that it was only when she married Wyatt Cooper, her fourth husband, the one she called the love of her life, that she understood what it felt like to have a father, because Wyatt was the father she had never had. She said it without self-pity, with the directness of someone who has examined the architecture of their own loss and described it accurately. Her mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, young, beautiful, 20 years old at her husband's death, was not, by the accounts that accumulated around her in the years that followed, a woman designed by temperament or inclination for the sustained, daily, unglamorous work of single parenthood. She was the daughter of a minor diplomat, the twin sister of Thelma Morgan, who was, during these same years, the mistress of the Prince of Wales, and who would introduce the prince to Wallis Simpson, an act of social consequence that she would spend the remainder of her life regretting. Gloria Morgan moved, after her husband's death, to Paris, to London, to Cannes, to Monte Carlo, the circuit of the international social world that the Vanderbilt name and the Child's Trust Fund made available to her. She crossed the Atlantic as frequently as once a month. She took little Gloria sometimes, and sometimes left her with her grandmother and the nurse named Emma Keislich, called Dodo, who had been hired 2 weeks after the baby's birth and who would become, in the years of her mother's absence, the only constant adult presence in the child's life. Dodo was not a parent. She was a nurse, and her care for Gloria was genuine and her consistency real, and those qualities, the consistency, the daily presence, the reliable warmth of someone who was simply there, were so uncommon in Gloria's early life that they registered as love, and they were love of the kind available within the relationship. But Dodo was an employee, and employees can be dismissed, and this fact that the closest thing Gloria had to a mother could be removed at any moment by decisions made above both of them was one she would learn in the worst possible circumstances. The childhood that Gloria lived before the custody trial was, in its practical dimensions, one of considerable material comfort and considerable human instability. She had a bodyguard because the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby in 1932 had made wealthy families acutely aware of the specific dangers attendant on visible wealth, and the Vanderbilt name was the most visible available. She was attended by her grandmother Morgan, and by Dodo, and by various servants in the apartments and rented houses that constituted the circuit of her early existence. She lived in hotels and in leased properties in New York and Paris and London and Cannes, following the progress of her mother's social life, at the distance that her mother's social life required, sometimes close, sometimes very far away, always managed by people other than the woman who had given birth to her. She sent postcards from Europe to her grandmother in New York. "My mother is so bad to me, I wish I could run away to New York to you. We are moving again, oh what a life." The postcards are not the communications of a child being mistreated in any dramatic sense. They are the communications of a child who is simply not being loved in the ordinary, daily, boring, essential way that children require. She was small and dark and quiet. She was a child who read, already, with the focused attention of someone who has found that books are more reliable than adults. She had the posture, in the photographs of this period, of a child who is being very carefully not noticed, who has concluded that the safest way to be in rooms where adults are managing things above her head is to be as small as possible and observe as much as possible, and make no demands that might cause the people she depends on to find her inconvenient. The trust fund that Reginald had left his daughter was worth $5 million, the equivalent, in current money, of something approaching $90 million. A portion of it generated income for the child's upkeep. The court had assigned Gloria Morgan a monthly allowance of $4,000 for the child's maintenance. The Vanderbilt family, specifically Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Reginald's eldest sister, the sculptor who had founded the Whitney Museum of American Art and who controlled $78 million of her own, had been watching the expenditure of this allowance with increasing displeasure from across the Atlantic. Gertrude Whitney was formidable in the specific way that women of her generation and her wealth sometimes were. Cultivated, principled, possessed of strong opinions, and accustomed to the assumption that her strong opinions were correct. She had watched her niece's mother spend the allowance on a social life in European capitals, while the child was left with a nurse in various rented accommodations. She had watched the child grow pale and thin and develop the particular quietness of a small person who has concluded that the adults in her world are not reliably present. She had sent investigators. She had accumulated evidence. In 1934, when Gloria was 10 years old, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney filed for custody. The trial of the century. The custody trial that opened in New York in October 1934 was given its name, the Trial of the Century, by the tabloid press that had been covering wealthy families' private disasters for a decade, and that recognized, in this particular case, something that transcended the ordinary category of rich people's troubles. It had everything the Depression-era public both needed and resented: unimaginable wealth, displayed without apparent awareness of the world beyond it; a neglected child whose money was being spent while she was being left alone; a young mother whose lifestyle offered the tabloids material they did not need to embellish; and a child whose testimony given privately to the judge, away from her mother's lawyers who had produced loving letters she had written, was understood to have been the deciding factor. The courtroom was open to the press until the day a French maid, asked by a lawyer whether she had ever witnessed improper conduct from Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, said yes. She described Lady Milford Haven, a member of the British royal family in the elder Gloria's bed, with her arm around Mrs. Vanderbilt's neck, kissing her just like a lover. The judge, in the subsequent silence, closed the courtroom. What had been said could not be unsaid, and the papers that printed it did so with the appetite of publications that had found that shame and money, combined, were the most reliable sellers of newspapers in the middle of a depression. The child, 10 years old, slight, dark-eyed, aware enough to be frightened and young enough not to fully understand what was frightening, had been told, in private, by her nurse Dodo, by her grandmother Morgan, and by the general atmosphere of the household in which she was living, that her mother was a bad person and that she should say so to the judge. She said so. Her mother's lawyers produced the loving letters she had written. "My darling mummy, I love you so much," as evidence of a bond more genuine than the child's testimony suggested. Gloria later said, with the precision of someone who has spent decades trying to understand what happened in that courtroom, "I had no relationship with her at all. I just worshipped her from afar. I felt no connection at all. I felt like an imposter." The judge awarded custody to Gertrude Whitney. Gloria Morgan was granted weekend visits in the month of July. The court, in the same order that awarded Gertrude Whitney the child she had fought for, dismissed Dodo, the nurse, who had been the closest thing to a constant parent in Gloria's entire life, on the grounds that her influence was too great. The decision was made, as many decisions in the lives of wealthy children are made, by people who believed they were acting in the child's best interests and who were entirely correct about the general principle and entirely wrong about this specific consequence. Gloria later said, "Losing Dodo was the most devastating thing. She was the only one who loved me. When they took her away, I was truly alone." The press had a name for her now. The poor little rich girl, a phrase taken from a Sinclair Lewis short story, applied to the 10-year-old at the center of the most publicized custody battle of the era, and printed in enough newspapers that it achieved the particular permanence of things repeated until they become the lens through which everything else is read. She would spend the next 85 years of her life proving the description both true and meaningless simultaneously. True in the obvious sense that she was rich and that the money had not prevented the unhappiness. Meaningless in the sense that it reduced an extraordinary life to its worst early chapter and invited the reader to stop there. She did not stop there. The capacity for continuation, for getting up and continuing, for finding the next thing, for the particular refusal of permanent defeat that those who knew her always cited as her defining quality, was already present in the 10-year-old who sat in the judge's chambers and told the truth as she understood it, and walked out into a world where her photograph was on the front page of every newspaper in New York. The marriages. She was 17 years old when she married for the first time, and the marriage was both entirely understandable and, in retrospect, entirely predictable in the way of choices made by people who have grown up without adequate love and who mistake proximity to power for the thing itself. Pat DiCicco was Cary Grant's agent, 10 years older, socially connected in the Hollywood world that Gloria had fled to from her aunt's Long Island estate, with the relief of a bird released from a cage that was her own description, used more than once. As of the moment she escaped Gertrude Whitney's guardianship and arrived in California in 1941. He was also, by her later account, an abusive husband who called her Fatsy Rue and hit her and made the 5 years of their marriage a sustained education in the distinction between attention and affection. She divorced him in 1945. Her aunt, who had already disinherited her for marrying without permission at 17, did not restore the inheritance. The second marriage was to Leopold Stokowski, the celebrated conductor, 63 years old to her 21, a man whose distinction as an artist was genuine and whose relationship to the truth about his own age was somewhat creative. During the Stokowski custody battle when they divorced, Gloria revealed in court that he was actually 85 rather than the 72 he had claimed. He denied it. The marriage had produced 2 sons, Leopold Stanislaus and Christopher, and a decade of what she described as learning to be herself, in the sense that the analysts she began seeing during those years advised her to express herself, and she rented a studio and began to write poetry and paint, which was the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. Sidney Lumet, the film and television director, was the third husband. They were married for 7 years. When she left the marriage, Lumet attempted suicide, a fact that those who knew him attributed to the quality of the attachment rather than to any deficiency in his character or her reasons for leaving. He recovered. They remained in later years on civil terms. And then, on Christmas Eve, 1963, she married Wyatt Emery Cooper. Wyatt Cooper was a Mississippi writer, not a successful one, not a famous one, not a wealthy one, not a man in possession of any of the attributes that the previous 3 husbands had variously represented or promised. He was 35 years old, 8 years younger than Gloria, a handsome man with blue eyes and a quality of genuine attentiveness that those who knew him described with consistent warmth. He had grown up in Quitman, Mississippi, the youngest of 5 brothers in a family of limited means and considerable closeness. He knew who he was. He had the particular groundedness of a person whose sense of self has never depended on the opinion of rooms that didn't know him. He was, Gloria later said, the love of her life. He was the first person who had ever fully seen her, not the heiress, not the poor little rich girl, not the label or the lawsuit or the famous name, but the woman who had been writing poetry since her teens and painting seriously for years, and who had, beneath the public persona that the world had constructed around her since childhood, a creative life that she had been trying to express for decades, with the difficulty of someone building a studio in the middle of a hurricane. Wyatt Cooper read her poems and told her they were good. He encouraged the painting. He was, she said, the father she had never had to herself, and then to their sons Carter and Anderson, who were born in 1965 and 1967. They were happy. This is not a word that appears frequently in Gloria Vanderbilt's story before this marriage, and it is worth pausing on it. They were happy, domestically, in the sustained and daily way that happiness in a family actually works, present at meals, attentive to the children, building something that had the quality of a home rather than an arrangement. Anderson Cooper has described his father as the glue that held the family together, a description that gains its full weight from everything that happened after the glue was removed. Wyatt Cooper went into hospital for open-heart surgery on the 5th of January, 1978. He had a series of heart attacks on the operating table. He was 50 years old. Gloria was at the hospital. Anderson was 10. Carter was 12. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one. The person who most loved Gloria Vanderbilt for who she actually was died at 50 years old after 15 years of marriage, and the decade that followed was the most difficult of her life, which is a high bar, given the competition. The loss of Wyatt did not break her. Nothing broke her. But everything after it was conducted for many years in the shadow of what had gone, and the shadow was long. The long cost. In the decade between Wyatt Cooper's death in January 1978 and Carter Cooper's death in July 1988, Gloria Vanderbilt did something that surprised everyone who had been watching her story as a story of an heiress and had missed the story of an artist. She built a business empire. The Gloria Vanderbilt jeans launched in 1976, before Wyatt died, and reaching their commercial peak in the years immediately after were not, as they are sometimes characterized, the hobby of a wealthy woman who attached her name to a product. They were the result of a genuine commercial instinct and a genuine aesthetic sensibility applied to a market women's denim that nobody had thought to treat as a luxury item, a canvas for design and personal expression. She put her signature on the back pocket and her face on the advertisements, and she understood, with the accuracy of someone who has spent a lifetime being looked at, that the women who bought her jeans were buying something beyond the denim. They were buying an assertion that a woman's name and a woman's taste were worth attaching to something she wore on her body. The jeans generated $100 million in annual sales at their peak. She received a 3.5% royalty. In 1979 alone, that royalty, on $125 million in sales, made her not merely wealthy by inheritance, but wealthy by her own commercial achievement, a distinction she valued, and that those who reduced her story to the inheritance tended to overlook. She expanded shoes, scarves, table and bed linens, fragrances, china. The Gloria Vanderbilt brand was, in the late 1970s and the 1980s, one of the most recognizable in American fashion. She was the first woman to put her name on denim. She had done it while raising 2 young boys after the sudden death of their father, while managing the grief of a very particular kind, the grief of a person whose happiness had been so new and so complete and so brutally interrupted that the world without it required rebuilding from foundations. She was also, in these same years, painting, seriously, consistently, in a body of work that those who have examined it carefully describe as genuinely accomplished collages and oils that drew on the imagery of dreams, of childhood, of the American interior life, with a surrealist edge and a personal vocabulary that bore the marks of someone who had been reading widely and thinking carefully about what art was for and what she wanted it to do. She was not a painter who dabbled. She had the practice of someone for whom art was not a supplement to life, but a form of understanding it, a way of processing, at the level where language does not reach, the accumulated materials of her experience. And then came Carter. On the 22nd of July, 1988, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, Princeton graduate, editor at American Heritage magazine, 23 years old, swung off the terrace wall of his mother's 14th floor apartment on Sutton Place and fell to the pavement below. Gloria had called her doctor, had been trying to reach Carter through whatever was consuming him in that moment. She was there. She saw it. She could not stop it. Anderson, 21 years old, received the phone call that his brother was dead. 10 years after the loss of their father, the family lost Carter. The glue was already gone. Now the walls came down. Gloria wrote a book about it, A Mother's Story, published in 1,996 inches, which she described her belief that the suicide had been triggered by a psychotic episode induced by an allergic reaction to an anti-asthma medication. Whether this was the explanation that allowed her to live with what had happened, or the explanation that was true, or both, is not something the outside world can determine. What is determined is that she wrote it, and that the writing of it was an act of the same creative impulse that had sustained her through everything else. The conviction that what is witnessed must be described, that what is suffered can be transformed into language, that the artist's obligation to experience is to make something from it, rather than simply survive it. In the same period, the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Gloria discovered that her business partners had defrauded her. She sued her former lawyer and her partners in GV Limited, eventually winning a judgment of $1.79 million in 1995. By then, the lawyer had died, and the money was uncollectible. The designer jeans empire had been sold. The brand name had passed through various commercial hands. She had, in the space of approximately a decade, watched her husband die, her son die, her business dissolve, and her legal victory become theoretical. She joined a suicide support group, which she later said saved her life. She described walking into a room of strangers who were all at rock bottom, and looking at the one who had been there for 10 years and was still alive, and understanding that survival was possible. You could look at him and say, "It's been 10 years and he's alive and okay." She was alive and okay. She kept painting. The creative life. The life that Gloria Vanderbilt built with the materials of her talent, and she was genuinely talented, in several distinct and separately demonstrable ways, is the part of her story that the poor little rich girl narrative has most consistently obscured, because the narrative requires its subject to be defined by what happened to her rather than by what she made. She published her first book of poetry in 1955, when she was 31. Over the course of her life, she published 7 memoirs, 2 novels, a book of collage, a design book, and a collection of autobiographical writings, a body of literary work produced across 7 decades by a woman who had been writing seriously since her teens, and who brought to the page the same quality of direct, unsentimental honesty that characterized everything else about her. Her memoir, Once Upon a Time, published in 1985, is a portrait of her childhood self, of unusual precision, written with the eye of a painter and the ear of a woman who has been listening, all her life, to the undertone beneath what people say out loud. She acted professionally on Broadway in The Time of Your Life, and on television in a range of dramatic productions through the 1950s and 1960s, including Playhouse 90, Studio One, and Kraft Theatre, where she appeared alongside the significant dramatic talents of the era and received reviews that took her seriously as a performer rather than as a celebrity turn. She studied acting with the rigor of someone who had concluded that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing properly, and her teachers and her directors made remarks about her abilities that had the quality of genuine assessment rather than the flattery extended to wealthy students. She was photographed by Cecil Beaton, by Gordon Parks, with whom she maintained a romantic relationship for many years, by Horst P. Horst, by the best portrait photographers of the 20th century, and the photographs they produced of her are among the defining images of American elegance across several decades. She had, as her father had observed at her birth, something that the camera found. She used it, on her own terms, for her own purposes, as a commercial vehicle for her fashion brand, as an artistic subject in her own work, as the surface that the world insisted on engaging with and that she engaged with in return, without mistaking it for the substance underneath. And then there was the relationship with Anderson. Anderson Cooper became, after the deaths of Wyatt and Carter, the person with whom Gloria Vanderbilt was closest, her son and her survivor, and the person to whom she was most completely honest about the life she had lived. The HBO documentary, Nothing Left Unsaid, which premiered at Sundance in 2016, and the memoir, The Rainbow Comes and Goes, published the same year, are the record of a relationship between a mother and son that is remarkable for its quality of genuine mutual seeing, 2 people who have both lost the same people and who are trying, in conversation, to understand what they have survived and what they have become. Anderson Cooper said of his mother, after her death, she was determined to make something of her life, determined to make a name for herself and find the love she so desperately needed. The observation contains, in its 3 clauses, the whole of what she actually achieved. She made something of her life. She made a name that was hers rather than the name inherited, and she found the love in Wyatt, in her sons, in the painting and the writing that she had been looking for since the morning in 1934, when the judge's decision sent Dodo away and left her, as she said, truly alone. The final years. She was, by every account of those who knew her in the last decades of her life, the youngest person in any room she entered, not in the trivially flattering sense of a woman who has preserved her appearance well, but in the more interesting sense of a woman who had retained, against all the evidence of what a long life does to optimism, a genuine quality of forward orientation. Something wonderful is about to happen. She said it regularly, and she appeared to mean it, and those who heard it found it given the inventory of what she had lived through, not naive, but earned. The optimism of someone who has discovered, through the process of surviving loss after loss after loss, that the self which remains after each loss is more resilient than expected, and that the expectation of good things is not a denial of bad things, but a choice made alongside them. She painted through her 80s. She published her erotic novel, Obsession, in 2009, at 85, with the composure of a woman who had concluded that age was a category error when applied to what one wrote about, and that the only thing that would embarrass her was bad writing. She was not embarrassed. She maintained her friendship with Diane von Furstenberg, who described her as a genuine and lasting friend, a woman of remarkable creative energy and personal warmth, who had the quality that the best artists have of making everyone around them feel seen. She maintained the relationship with Anderson, which grew deeper as they both aged, the mother and the son who had lost the same people, and who had chosen, in response to that loss, to talk about it rather than to manage it in the patrician silence that Gloria had described as the waspy background I come from, where rich people don't communicate. In June 2019, Gloria was taken to hospital. The doctors told her she had very advanced stomach cancer, that it had spread, and that the situation was not one she could recover from. She was silent for a while, her son reported. Then she said, "Well, it's like that old song, 'Show me the way to get out of this world,' because that's where everything is." She died on the 17th of June, 2019, at her home in Manhattan, surrounded by friends and family, at the age of 95. She was interred in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum on Staten Island, the same mausoleum where Cornelius the Commodore lies, where the accumulated Vanderbilts have been laid to rest since the dynasty began. In the mausoleum with her, she had specified, her son Carter, who had died 31 years before her, and Wyatt Cooper, the man she had called the love of her life and the father she had never had, who had died 41 years before her. The estate she left behind was worth approximately $1.5 million. The woman who had been born to a $5 million trust fund, who had built a $100 million jeans business, who had been the subject of the most expensive custody battle of the Depression era, died with $1.5 million. The distance between those two numbers is not a story about squandering. It is a story about a woman who spent her money on the life she was actually living, on the studios and the canvases and the legal battles and the 4 marriages and the 4 sons and the 95 years of refusing to become only what the newspapers had decided she was. Anderson Cooper, his own mother's son in the quality of directness, if in few other ways, noted to journalists who asked about the estate that he had known his mother had no money and that this was fine with him because she had given him an infinitely more valuable inheritance. The example of how to live. The observation is not false modesty. It is the accurate assessment of a son who had been watching his mother get up from the canvas for 95 years. What remains? Return, now, to the photograph. Not the one from the terrace. The one from the courtroom, 1934. The 10-year-old in the dark coat, accompanied by a bodyguard and a nurse and a chauffeur, entering her mother's home in Midtown Manhattan for a supervised visit. Her expression is carefully composed. She has had, already, extensive experience of cameras and their expectations. We know, now, what we could not know then, or what the story required to be told fully, rather than as a tabloid headline about the distance between money and happiness. We know that the child in the photograph would spend 95 years in the process of becoming someone the photograph does not contain. That she would learn to paint, seriously, in rooms where nobody was watching. That she would write, honestly, about the courtroom, and Dodo, and the mother she worshipped from afar, and the father she never remembered. That she would find, at 39, a man from Mississippi with blue eyes, who read her poems and told her they were good, and that he would die at 50, and she would miss him for the remaining 41 years of her life, and would still, at 92, describe him as the love of her life with the directness of a woman who sees no reason to soften accurate descriptions. The irony at the center of Gloria Vanderbilt's life is not the irony that the poor little rich girl narrative supplies the simple, tired observation that money doesn't buy happiness, a formulation that requires its subject to have no qualities beyond her balance sheet. The real irony is the opposite of that, and it requires looking at the life rather than the label. She was given everything: the name, the money, the houses, the famous face, the social position, and the world used everything she was given to construct a story about her that had almost nothing to do with who she was. The story said, "Here is a girl defined by her fortune and her misfortune, by the money she inherited and the trial that distributed her, by the marriages that failed and the son who fell." The story was not false. It was simply not sufficient. What was sufficient was the painting she did in the studio, nobody photographed, the poetry she had been writing since her teens, the jeans she designed and put her name on when no woman had done it before, the memoir she wrote about her dead son at 72 because she believed that what is witnessed must be described, the documentary she made with Anderson at 91, in which she answered every question with the precision of someone who has decided that honesty is the only remaining obligation. The name she made was not the name she inherited. Cornelius Vanderbilt built the railroads. Gloria Vanderbilt built herself, repeatedly, out of the materials available to her, which were sometimes extraordinary and sometimes devastated, and always, in the end, sufficient for the purpose. She painted until she was old. She wrote until she died. She told her son, as the cancer made clear what was coming, to think of death as just another adventure. Then she went to find out if she was right. The poor little rich girl. The phrase has been attached to her name for 85 years, and it will probably outlast the name itself in the popular memory, because memorable phrases are more durable than complicated truths. But those who have read the memoirs, or stood in front of the paintings, or watched the documentary in which she and Anderson talked to each other, with the particular ease of two people who have agreed to stop pretending those people know that the phrase is the beginning of the story, not the whole of it. She was Gloria Vanderbilt. She was many other things as well. The many other things are the part worth staying for. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.